Hello and welcome to Embracing Freedom Today podcast, y'all. I'm so excited about this particular guest. She's a good, dear friend of mine for many years, but I want you to know who she is because you're going to be so impressed by her. And you know, I believe that there are actual superheroes in the world, and she's one of them. She's literally a Wonder Woman, a superwoman. And as she tells you her story, you're going to say, wow, like, this is incredible. You know, what I learned from Jessica Ambuehl, and you're going to fall in love with her and what she does and her heart behind and the reason why she does what she does. But what's so amazing about her, and I love to talk about my guests because I just want you to see why I invited them. I want you to feel my heart. But what I love about Jessica is that I don't know, she just no is not in her vocabulary as far as when someone says, hey, there's a challenge. She's like, let's go, let's do it. We can do it. Like there's nothing impossible. And those kind of people fuel me. They make me reflect on my own life and say, you know what? I can do this. Jessica, I can do this. So I love Jessica's drive and her tenacity. And she's just an incredible encouragement to my personal life. So I'm grateful for our connection. And I hope that she also inspires you as well. So let's just give her a warm welcome. Welcome, Jessica Ambuehl. Welcome to Embracing Freedom Today podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited to be here. This is a wonderful way not to just connect with you, but to connect with those who love your heart as well, because it goes both ways.
It
just goes both ways.
It does. So I'm just so excited, and I can't wait to dive in. So let's do just that. So the first thing I want to ask you, I always start at the very beginning, you know, because I want to know the foundation by which you blossomed from to be the person that you are today. So Jessica, please tell us a little bit about your childhood and your upbringing and you know, all that wonderful stuff.
Well, I'm pretty fortunate because I still have parents that are married and living. I grew up in an incredibly supportive Christian home. And that's not a common thing you hear every day, unfortunately. And I don't want to take that for granted. So my parents were on staff with Campus Crusade for Christ when I was younger. I actually don't remember that because I was so little, but that's a wonderful foundation to start with. You know, Campus Crusade is now known as Cru, but my parents had a heart for serving college students. They went on a mission trip, so they had that heart for serving. And they moved eventually to the Midwest, had my brother, and I went to public school half my life. And then we joke about this because I went to private school the other half, and it wasn't because my parents felt called to switch me to a different type of educational system. I was actually the one that challenged my parents, and I don't remember this, but they said that I came to them and said, if you have faith, God will provide the money. I don't remember that at all. Well, let's see. So 6th grade is when I switched. So I went to public school K through 6, and then after the first quarter of 6th grade, we had an open house, and one of my teachers didn't remember me because there were so many kids in the class. And then a lot of the conversations that were happening in that building with kids my age and, you know, junior high, there were things happening that I didn't want to be a part of. And I just wanted to be in a different environment that was more encouraging and edifying also to my faith. Now I'm not saying that everyone should have that needs to jump ship and do that. I think there are pros and cons to everything. And I'm very thankful I had both. So you can be a light no matter where you are. But at that point in my life, that's what I was desiring. And so my parents were gracious enough, and they put me in a very, very small private school. And during that time, we were attending an evangelical free church, and they planted a church in Craiova, Romania. So when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, it opened up that part of Europe to nonprofits and ministries to come in and just serve the people. And so the church that I was attending had planted a church there. And so they would send teams there every summer for about 2 weeks, those short-term trips. And my first one was age 15. And that was a turning point, not necessarily in my faith, but just the journey that to where I am today now in my 40s, where I can see where God planted the seed and it just blossomed into what I am today. And it's as a believer, we can look back and see how God uses things, good things and bad things, to shape us into who we are. And that's definitely, that decision to go was a stepping stone into my character and my passions. And so I went on that trip. Again, it was 2 weeks. I was a mid-teenager, but I was hooked. I was hooked not only for travel, but just being in different cultures, and it wrecked my heart in a good way. And so I went the next few years for short-term trips. And then I went, I always get my years mixed up. And although you gave me time to look it up, I still don't remember. But essentially in the 90s, I went and I actually lived there for a summer. So I had a real heart for Romania. And I graduated high school a year early. So because I went to a private school, I was able to do 4 years in 3 years. So I just did a lot of extra work, really felt that I wanted to take that leap. I really wanted to get into college even earlier. And so right after I graduated, I had just turned 17. So a month after I turned 17, I graduate high school and I go and I live in Romania. Wow. And my parents, I shout out to my parents. I've told them this before, but I know that they had fear. There's obvious fear as us parents letting our kids go and explore the world and even just go down the store and buy food. Right. So, but because they already had a heart to serve years prior and they knew where my heart was, they said yes. And although I had graduated high school, I still was young. I mean, I had just turned 17 and I had been to Romania countless times, but this was moving there for a summer. I had another American as a roommate. We served the people there. The next year, I said, I want to go again. And they said, well, we have some other needs. And I said, great, where? And they said, well, how about Budapest, Hungary? So I went there. Didn't know anyone. I moved there by myself. Wow. I served again for the summer. The next summer, by that time I'm engaged, and my mom and my fiance and I went back to Romania. And then just over the course of many years, had a variety of trips, and they were all in serving capacities. So I've been married for over 20 years, have 2 boys, 17, he's at Camden, and Gavin, who'll turn 12 in April. So I'm a mama boys. I always thought I wanted a girl, and God had different plans. And to be honest, I love being a mama boys, and I couldn't imagine it any way else. So yeah, that gets you closer up to where I am today.
So I have always wanted to know how you became a photojournalist, going to all these very exotic places to do incredible work for different organizations. I wondered, where did that start? And so this is the first time I'm hearing this. And I'm like, okay, this makes sense now. I get it. And I'm like, wow, like what an incredible opportunity at such a young age. And like you said, the fact that your parents were open for you to go and live in Romania and do all these wonderful things at such a young age is a gigantic blessing. And so now I understand why you are wired the way you are and why your passions are what they are. And so that's really amazing. And that really is very telling when it comes to understanding how, like you said, how God breathes on something or connects something supernaturally or touches people's hearts to do what most people would think is absolutely crazy, but it makes sense and there's a peace about it, and then he blesses it and uses it to be a part of your life and part of your mission. So I think that's incredible. I think that's so incredible. Wow. Okay, so let's talk about, so I want to know about some of the places that you traveled. Like, let's talk about that. And while we're doing this, I'm going to put up these pictures of just different places, but please share where you've been.
Goodness. So in serving capacities, it's been like 16 countries, but as far as documenting through photojournalism, maybe 6 or 8. And it's interesting because I've talked about this before. And when I had a young crowd recently that I spoke to about photojournalism, and I said, God has our journey set out for us. We don't always see the end or even the stops along the way, but what's exciting is that when God's in your corner, you know that he's got your back. And so what's also exhilarating, which can also be fearful, it depends how you approach life, is every corner is a surprise. But if he knows what our heart is, it could be an amazing surprise. It could be something heartbreaking and hard, but we know that we try to grow from those. And so I can look back and go, wow, this journey to all these different places are just pieces of a thread, right, in our life journey. And so I'll take a step back and say my love for storytelling, I can see blossoming when I was in college. So I have a master's degree in media communications and public relations. And so my training or educational training is in how to market and advertise and tell people different things that appeal to them, right? So after that, I started to do this graphic design work just on the side, helping out some nonprofits, but my degree wasn't specifically in that, but I just started to dabble in it. Some of my professions gave me opportunities to kind of grow in those areas. And then I was sitting at church one Sunday, and I was in the commons area sitting there, and there was a woman sitting there as well. And it was just the two of us. And she made some comment about this nonprofit that she had started in Uganda. And her comment was relating to actually a frustration. And even though we didn't know each other, I was a listening ear. And she just said, you know, this company has offered to do these thank you cards for us, and they haven't done them. And I was like, well, I've got some experience. I'd be happy to help. And so it's just, I always say, just being aware and ready. You just have to listen. The opportunities are everywhere. It's just a matter of you taking the step to meet those needs. And so in that moment, I can look back and go, that one little conversation on that one day, it led to where I am today in photojournalism. And so I started doing some graphic design work for them. And then they started giving me some images, and I was like, these aren't good. And I wasn't a photographer. I just knew, like, I can't like enlarge them, and they look so blurry. And so I just said, you know, do you have anything that's a little bit more professional looking that I can put in these documents? And they're like, no, but why don't you come to Africa? Wow. And I always, yes, they're like, we're heading there. Why don't you come and just take some pictures? And I'm very transparent, because I always tell people, when I heard Africa, I immediately stereotyped it. I thought of bugs and snakes. That's all I thought of. And it was never on my list. Like, I had been to Romania and Hungary and Dominican Republic and all these other places, never Africa. But God said go, and I went. And it changed. Again, it was another stepping stone in this journey. And so there was a small medical team going, and they gave me a couple college interns, and I went and documented stories and took pictures. And you know, I can look back to the early 2000s and go, okay, some of them aren't bad. You know, obviously you grow in your in your strengths and talents. But I didn't even know I liked doing that. I borrowed a camera from my parents. I didn't even have a camera. Wow. And so I went, spent 2 weeks that were life-changing there, again, pulling on my heart of being in environments that are not like me, being the minority, being the outsider. I actually thrive on that. And I feel like those circumstances leave less room for me and more room for God. And so I'm going to grow the most in those moments. And I love meeting strangers.
Yes.
You know, that's not a common thing, and that's okay. But I think that's the way God built me, to be able to do what I do, to not be afraid and to just go when he calls. And so that's how it started. Is I was doing graphic design work. I heard a conversation in need, started that relationship, went on a trip, and I came back from that and thought, you know what? That was exhilarating. It not only was I doing ministry work, but I kind of like this photography thing, and I had no training in it. Oh. And so it was all self-taught over the years. And so what happened was I came back and people saw some photos, and they're like, oh, can you take my seniors' pictures? How about my family's pictures? And I was like, okay, sure. You know, it's income, and no, of course. And so I did that for a number of years in addition to some trips. And I just found that that wasn't meeting the need. And I think it was God solidifying the niche that he had created me for, this photojournalism, documenting the work and stories around the world, to expose people to truths that they may never see, may never know, but now they can no longer deny because I've shown it to them. And just changing worldwide perspectives to say, listen, there's so much beauty in the brokenness. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's bad. Reach out to those that you don't know that you need to see humanity before circumstances.
Yeah.
And so I, worked with this nonprofit for a little bit, and then I felt like God was just pulling on my heart saying, why don't you reach out to some other nonprofits and just show them some of your work and see if they have some need? And so I reached out to a few nonprofits I knew, some that others knew, and in a very short amount of time, I got an email back from a nonprofit, a children's home in Jamaica, and they said, our board was just praying for someone with your gift set. Can you come? And I was like, yes! And that's a whole other podcast in itself, just that period of time working with that nonprofit. But basically, what I started to do over the years then was I started just being proactive in, if I saw a nonprofit I thought had some room to grow as far as in photography, or a nonprofit that I loved or someone connected me with, just saying, this is what I do, here's my portfolio. If you can use it to tell your stories, to raise funds, to expose what you do to grow your audience, I'd be happy to do it. And so that's led to, I work with the couple nonprofits I mentioned, Go Overflow, which you and I have a heart for, and you introduced me to, Souls for Souls out of Nashville, and they go all over, Ideas, which goes into these very difficult areas that are unspoken of, that you really can't, I can talk about, but the missionaries there necessarily don't talk freely because of persecution. And I just kept looking, and God just kept growing it into relationships that enabled me to fulfill this passion, which I say feeds my soul. There is nothing like it. COVID just, I have really nothing to complain about. But a personal internal struggle was just feeling suffocated. All my trips overseas were canceled, and it's not luxurious. People hear you travel internationally. Oh, it sounds amazing. And I was like, well, sometimes I have water. There's no air conditioning. I'm riding in the back of a pickup truck in the dust. That's okay for me, but it's not like staying in a hotel and getting pampered. And again, we're all created differently, so that's okay. But there's some pretty amazing experiences along the way.
That is incredible, Jessica. That's incredible. So let's talk about the details of what photojournalism actually looks like. All right. So yeah, like you said, you're not, getting massages every day while you're eating strawberries in the hotel room. So tell us, what does that look like? If someone says, hey, we want you to come out with us, tell us some of a couple of stories or a couple of experiences on your journey. But first, tell us about the details of what that looks like.
So photojournalism is, telling a story with images. So I am charged with being somewhere and capturing something that tells a story in one image. I don't have 100 words. I don't have 5 minutes of video. I have one moment, one image to grab someone's attention and evoke an emotion in them for them to want to learn more, to be a part of that story, to donate, whatever that action point is. And so whenever I get on an airplane, I always had this little bit of excitement. I'm like, okay, God, I can't wait, because when I get on an airplane on the way back, I'm going to have some images that these opportunities you've given me. And there's always a few that stand out, obviously, on every trip, but it's kind of exciting to go, ooh, what are those going to be? What are they going to look like? But, for a lot of nonprofits that I work with, they have certain ministries and areas they want me to document. It can be visiting churches, visiting schools, going through villages. They have ministries to special needs. And so what I do is, when I get on the ground every day, they'll take me somewhere else. And I typically will tell someone, the more rural we can get, the better. That's just my heart. I like being in spaces where tourists don't go. And typically I'm in those spaces anyways, but as much as that as I can experience, the better. I just feel like it's more real. It's not commercialized. It's just raw. And that's what I love, is that raw humanity that we have, that God gave us, that we can't deny what we're seeing. And so, I was in India for a couple weeks, and every day I'd kind of get briefed on the next day. Okay, this driver is going to take you to this place. And so, one day we drove 3 hours to, I don't know where. You put a lot of trust in whoever's car you get into. And We drove 3 hours to the school. He got lost. In fact, that's probably we'll come up to this later, but as far as like safety wise, I'm pretty much of a risk taker, but there was this moment. I remember the driver was lost, and I had already driven with him once, but he pulled over to this outdoor cafe full of just men, and he's talking to them. And as I'm sitting there, I'm like, this is one of those movie moments where I could get kidnapped and no one would know where I am. But that's okay. I hope he comes back in the car just alone. So, we get back and we find the place, and they didn't start school until I got there. Like, they waited for me. And there's just that, talk about feeling special and honored. I don't look like anybody there, and they may not have seen someone like me ever in their life. I've had children cry because they've never seen someone with white skin, and so they think I'm a ghost because of stories their families have told. In this instance, no one cried, but I got there and they had drums going. They invited me up on stage in front of their entire school to speak. And then the headmaster took me to every single classroom, and all of them stood up and greeted me. One teacher asked me to sing for the class. I did. I know you're surprised.
Can you sing?
What?
Sing? Can you sing?
Just a little bit.
Okay, good. That's enough.
Jesus loves me. And then they took me to another class. They're like, you can teach today. And I'm like, oh,
what?
Great. Okay. So, you can't say no most of the time, but you have to be ready to consistently be uncomfortable.
Yes.
And when you get to the point where uncomfortable becomes, for those of us, I think, who got created this way, and specifically in photojournalism, you have to be okay with that. You have to be okay with, there's a skill, and I think it only comes from personality and from experience, but a skill from walking into an environment and immediately trying to gain trust from those around you. I once had someone in another country say, how do you do that? I see you don't use a long lens. You get really close to people. How do you do that? And I was like, I don't know. It's just the way God created me. So I feel like that's one of my superpowers. You talked about that. I don't talk about that often, but I didn't realize that was really a God-given gift. Sounds too big of a word, but ability to create familiarity very quickly and not make someone feel devalued or less than because I'm in that moment. And there are some hard moments. There was a time in Jordan. Typically, I will tell people where I'm going ahead of time, but I knew because of the country that I probably won't post too much until I land because of perceptions of the culture and people. And of course, some of the comments were immediately, be careful, do this, watch your back. And because I travel a lot by myself, I have an amazing supportive family because I know not everybody feels comfortable doing that. And so there was a lot of fear, but by the end of the trip, I actually had someone say, yeah, you really changed my perspective on refugees and people in the culture. And there's obviously, in every culture, there's good people and bad people, no matter where you go in the world. Right. But in that moment, there's just this charge, this challenge of, I've got to present beauty within this brokenness, whatever this brokenness is. There are a few moments over my photojournalism journey that stick out because of the nature of what I do. I am allowed to be in certain environments that most people wouldn't. And that's an honor. I don't want to take those for granted. So for instance, in Jordan, they said we have this special program for men. These are refugee men. They can't work and provide for their family. They're paid under the table. So we're trying to create this community for them where they talk about heart stuff, which they don't typically do in their culture. And then they do some exercising together just for something fun to do as men. And they're like, so women aren't usually allowed, but we want you to come. And I'm like, okay. And then they said, but you can't be in there in the beginning because we talk about some really tough things, like why not to beat your wife. I'm like, okay. I respect that. I'll stay wherever you want me to. And we get there and they said, no, we want you to come in. I was like, okay. So I wasn't the only person with this color skin. There was one other gentleman, but I obviously am the only woman. And they were as friendly and just as jolly and wonderful as can be. But just sit there and hear these refugee men pour out their hearts of, they were talking about why we should love other people. And these are people that are prosecuting them or not caring for them. That was a huge moment that always sticks. Another time, it wasn't planned. It was planned in God's timing, but not in my agenda. But I was taken to an eye clinic, and I was just taking pictures of these refugees getting, glasses and so forth. And the pastor came in and said, "Hey, do you want to come with me and my wife? We're going to go hand out food to refugee homes." And I was like, "Absolutely." Again, don't know this gentleman. I know my driver did, so there's some validation. But we get in and we visit only 3 homes because, as you know, Michelle, things overseas take a lot longer. So when you stop, you get fed, you get drinks. And even though they have so very little, they treat you like your best friend. And so the one that sticks out is the last visit. It took all afternoon for these 3, but they welcomed me in, they sat down, they gave me a huge plate of things that I don't know everything that was on there. But the pastor sat next to me and translated, and the gentleman and his wife, and then they had like a 20-something-year-old son still living in this very tiny space. And this is one of my favorite pictures. And the man of the house sits down on a couch, and the light's pouring in just right. And I so wanted to just pull out my camera and say, "Can I take a picture?" But I felt like that wasn't the right moment, and I needed to honor the situation. And so he started to tell me about his story, how they were kicked out of their homeland from ISIS and struggling to survive now. And his wife is crying, and he's shedding tears, and I'm crying. And just to be given that gift to share that moment with them, they said, their daughter was teaching a neighbor English, and then they told the ISIS about her, and she had to leave. And it puts life in perspective. They're like perspective checks, and I get a lot of them, which I'm very thankful for. And so after hearing those stories, we shed tears together, and we had shared enough to afterwards and eating and so forth. I said, "May I take your picture?" And he was so happy. They were so happy to get their picture taken. He's not smiling in the picture, but it just says so much in that moment. And so that's one of my favorite. But I think to do photojournalism well, you need to have a risk taker kind of mentality, because you don't know where you're going. You don't know who you're going to meet. I've been near men with machine guns, not in the fear of my life, but it's a common sight. I've been in a country where every time I stopped to stay somewhere, they had to call the government to let them know that Jessica, the American, was staying there. There are certain things that don't happen in the US that happen elsewhere. But one of my favorite stories, which I tell often, is we were leaving in a village in India, and the driver picked up pretty quickly on how I like to work. Because I'll say sometimes, "Can we stop? Can you just wait a minute?" So we're driving out of this village on a dirt road, and we see just over the hill down into the valley some women working in a rice field. And he looks at me, and I look at him. We don't say a word. He just stops. And he starts backwards on this dirt road. I jump out of the car with my camera, and I run down the hill. So imagine like all these African women working, which they've done for decades, and they see this little white woman with a big camera running towards them. And it's a great moment. But I had another instance in Tunisia where my host was, he drove me everywhere. And so he pulled over, and I said, "Oh, there's some people in the field. I'm going to go." And he goes, "Do you want me to come?" And I was like, "No, I'm good." I just ran off. I don't speak their language. I know nothing of what they're going to say, but it's amazing the connection you can make with someone, even when you're so different. Yeah. And those are those moments that are just priceless.
So name some of those countries that you have actually done photo I don't know what I'm having a hard time saying this word. Photojournalism. Tell us some of the places that you've been.
So Tunisia, Jordan, Jamaica, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Haiti, Uganda. And then I didn't know I was doing it at the time, but when I was in Romania and Hungary, I did a little bit as well. So
incredible. Yeah. And I've seen some of your work, Jessica. first of all, you have a very natural gift. When you look at your photos, they are so loaded with so much emotion, and you can tell it's a powerful moment of just capturing a very sensitive, important, fun, intense moment of humanity. And it's just such a gift that you have. And I'm going to show the picture that you sent me. She actually blew this up, and it was a sweet surprise. She sent it to my home, and I'm going to show that right now. It is a gorgeous picture of this beautiful, a young girl. What country was that?
That was India, and there's a little story behind it.
Tell me about it.
That that was a slum that I had visited prior, and it's a very weird thing to say, but it was my favorite slum. One reason being I arrived, I had visited several before. This one was quite large, and there was a school in the front of it. And there was class 1 through 10 in one room, and they just divided it by partitions. So a little room with students, and then there was a separate building for the kindergarten, and then they used that for church later on. But the headmaster, after spending some time at their school, took me around the entire slum and introduced me to people. And there was a young girl who was in the school, and she held my hand and then my arm the entire way through. And I didn't realize, I mean, I knew what incredible experience that was, and just in the experiences that I had. But when I got back to my apartment that day, there was another young American girl who, she wasn't a photojournalist, but she was working with this ministry for a while. And she's like, yeah, we went to go visit this slum, but they wouldn't take me around. They wouldn't take me or the guy around. And I was like, oh, well, I got a full tour. And so, in that moment, you're like, oh, I'm so thankful sometimes. I'm thankful and proud of being a photojournalist, to have that trust that people have. And granted, some people like their picture taken, some people don't. But essentially, I went back to the same slum, and they had church. And so this little room is packed full of people. And I've never, and Michelle, you know this, there are certain cultures that when they worship, it's so intense that it's just, you just feel it in every ounce of your body. And we don't always worship that way in the US. And I'm not saying one way is better than the other, but their life is poured out of them, and they don't care what other people think that are in the room. And so, and a lot of times in cultures, kids, they'll just walk around the whole time. If my kids did that at Sunday church, we'd right? Hear that.
I know.
Yes. So everyone is praying, and if there was sound to that picture, you would hear it was just intense. And there's a balance between, it's only happened twice in my years of doing this, where you feel like maybe I shouldn't have taken that picture. Like in that moment, am I impeding on that moment? So it's happened twice, not in this case, but it could have been. So they're praying. So I'm observing. I don't know what's being said. I know what's going on, but I decide, I always have my camera ready, and I'm looking around. I have been watching this little girl, and I just turn, and she's looking at me. I just happened to catch her in that moment. And it was that picture is probably my favorite. I've never said I had a favorite, but that one speaks to so much of just, I see you in the midst of all of this chaos and trouble and hurt and poverty that this room is filled with. I see you. I see you for how God created you. And just that feeling of being accepted and seen is what photojournalism is kind of all about, and what we all desire in our lives, to be heard and to be seen no matter our circumstances. And so, that has a couple meanings behind it, being one of my favorite places I've ever visited. But also, when I left that slum, I had some school kids following me, and they were laughing, and there are pigs in the background. Like, this is not this isn't my kids going to school. There's not the same setting, obviously, but they're laughing. And I turn around, say goodbye. And of course my camera's ready. And I took a picture, and this is, again, one of my favorites all-time pictures. They're just laughing and happy. And if you would just Photoshop them out and put them in American soil at my kids' school, it'd be a very different perspective. There are there are shacks made out of tarps, and there's sewage, and there's pigs walking around, and they're as happy as my kids are in a very different situation. And that's actually the purpose of the name of my company, Under the Tree Designs, is just finding contentment no matter what. I know you didn't ask this, but do you want me to tell you what the name means?
Yes, please. Please.
So, Under the Tree Designs, I was doing this graphic design work. It was before I was even doing photojournalism, but I was doing so much with nonprofits. I was like, I should put a name to what I'm doing, right? I should be a little bit more legit. So, coming up with the name is not always the easiest, but I want it to be impactful and personal. And I was at church, and they had a special group come in from the Sudan. And if you're familiar with the Sudan boys, there's a movie made about them that essentially they're a little bit older now, and they visit different churches and places and tell their story. And so they were on stage talking about how militants were coming in to take the kids to become soldiers and kill everyone else. And this particular village had heard that they were coming. So they had a little bit of notice. They sent all their kids off with no notice, and a bishop, an older gentleman, to lead them. And they walked for weeks, and they saw many of their loved ones. The kids saw their own friends die from starvation. They said from vultures and lions. And so they're telling these stories, and the bishop comes up and he says, but you know what? We found a tree. We found a tree for shade and to worship under. And in that moment, God said, Under the Tree Designs, and it's stuck ever since. The idea of still having contentment in even the worst of circumstances, to still finding that little thing you can be thankful for, no matter what's going on. And so that's the meaning of the name.
Jessica, that is absolutely beautiful. I love that. I absolutely love that. Wow. Okay, y'all. I know you are already like, this woman's incredible. Like all that she does, and I know you're seeing some of the work that she has done. And but we're going to take a quick break. I want you to watch this quick video about what she does. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the challenges that she faces in photojournalism and how it affects her life. Because it's wonderful and it's beautiful, but you better believe there's also some challenges that come with this. And so we're going to talk about that when we get back, okay? Right after this. All right, we're back. I know you enjoyed that. And I want to talk about, Jessica, share with us about some of the challenges that you are faced with. And not just in photojournalism, period, but just kind of like your environment. Like, when you're wired differently, to see the world differently, relationships, conversations are going to be a little bit more challenging because they're not the average conversations that you have, because you've experienced things that most people haven't. So let's talk about those challenges that you face as a photojournalist.
That is very true. It almost brings a tear to my eye, because although I would not change a thing about my life, and what God has granted me the opportunities with, one of the biggest struggles is just feeling out of place. And, you know, you hear people say, oh, I'm amazed that you get on an airplane, you go to all these places, and aren't you concerned about your life? And what about your kids? And I'm like, well, they have a father and family, so they're fine. I love that my family knows that I leave and I come back and they see the results of it. But I feel out of place most times. When I see certain PSAs or documentaries, it hits home differently, and that's actually a gift. But it's hard to find someone that would understand my emotional reaction. A lot of people say it's hard to go, and I'm like, well, for me, it's not. I'm wired differently. It's easy to go. I am ready to jump on an airplane any day, anywhere. In fact, sometimes I've been asked to go places, and I have no idea where on a map it is, and I don't even care. I just say yes. So that's me. That's not everybody, and that's okay. If we were all wired the same, this would be a pretty boring world, right? So I'm glad for how God created me. However, it is very, very difficult to come back. And it's not because I don't want to see my family or my kids or appreciate what I have here. It is, you see life differently, as you said, Michelle. It's hard to be in conversations where people are complaining about their closet size, or that they had to wait in line for some item that would not even be feasible to someone living in a village. And, you know, there's that balance between, it's understandable to be frustrated, but not upset. My job is to hopefully change some of the perspectives so people interact with life differently, that they think about things differently. You know, even with my kids, I have found, because I've been doing this for most of their lives, is to not get upset with them. They definitely have heard the phrase, you know, there are kids in Africa who don't have.
Of course.
But people say that, but I've been there. I've seen it. I've experienced it. I've touched them. And let me show you some pictures because they're all over our wall. In fact, my oldest son has, years ago, he's like, Mom, our house is so creepy. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, most people have pictures up of their family. You have pictures up of all these strangers. And I was like, that's right. I said, there's a few of you guys, but this is to remind you that life is not about you, that life is bigger than your bubble. I want you to think, I want you to move on from creepy to normal, but I get that it's not everybody's house. In fact, we had a birthday party a couple years ago, and we were all outside, and a mom brought in their son, and she later told me, she's like, we just walked into your house, you know, to see where you were at, and their little boy goes, Mom, I think we're in the wrong house. And she's like, why? She goes, because all these pictures, they don't look like the Ambuehls. They look nothing like them. And I was like, good, that's great. And it's okay to feel different. That is a constant heart check of like, okay, so how are you doing life? But things that concern me versus things that concern someone else who hasn't had these same experiences are very different. And so I don't want to become jaded towards people. I want to have a merciful heart, but also be open to opening my mouth if I want to challenge something or just bring a new perspective. I also don't want to be that person that always brings up third world countries or poverty. You know, there's a balance between educating and informing, and but also trying to have some understanding of this is the way you grew up, and you wouldn't know any different unless you were told or taught. But there's also, I think, a responsibility that God gives us to explore that which we don't know.
Yes.
Because we get safe in our bubble, and safe doesn't equal growth. That just equals comfortableness. But you're not going to have a full life unless you get out of that box. And so I want my boys to remember that their walls are filled with people in other countries. I was like, I don't even know their names. These are just images that stick out to me. So that's the hardest thing, is not being bitter towards people where I live. And always the struggle of wanting to go and not always being it's not always in God's timing. In fact, there was a time where I really felt called to go to Haiti. It's like, God, I want to go. And of course, a lot of people want to go when they see the earthquake happen, and we all want to be there and hold the kids and whatnot. But I just felt like God, I feel like you're calling me there. And I tried. I started working with the nonprofit, doing design work for them. Just God kept closing every single door. And the amazing thing that happened, I knew it was supposed to be in God's timing, but I felt like my timing was right. He just didn't get the memo, right? So, I'd get on my schedule. But I can look back and go, oh my goodness, of course it worked out in your timing. I was on vacation. My in-laws were celebrating like 40 years of marriage. We all went, all the family drove to Florida. One day we happened to go with my mother-in-law and my niece, and we go walking around at this outdoor market. And I happened to find a flyer just laying around from this nonprofit. I pick it up, I look into them, I call them, and I was like, hey, this is what I do. If you ever need that service, let me know. Yeah, actually, we would love to use you. We really could use you on the next trip. It's to Haiti. And I was like, oh.
Wow.
And so just, a reminder that God's got my back.
Wow. Wow.
So, number one, feeling out of place often is a hard one. And then I do feel like on a lot of trips, Satan tends to attack me physically. That's the way he's always used tactics to get to me if things are going well. So there have been some instances where I've gotten really, really sick overseas, or an injury happens before I go and I have to hike for 6 hours in the jungle. And God always has come through. It's not like I'm dying on a bed, but there's been some scary moments, and it's just like I feel like, but if I'm doing it right, if I'm not lukewarm, then I should expect it. So, I don't want to say bring it on, but still the same concept of, okay, if I'm doing what you want me to, God, I should know that something's going to kind of try to get in my way, or at least discourage me. So I can say that I don't feel like I've forced any of my trips since age 15. I don't feel like I've pushed the door open and made my way to go. God has always just been very clear on when and where.
That's incredible. And that's very important to know that. You need to know that it's the Lord that's opened these opportunities for you, because that just makes that all of what you're doing feel so, I don't know, there's just a peace knowing that I didn't push these doors open. God opened the door. I was supposed to be there. I was supposed to tell these stories and work with these organizations. And that means you're living in purpose. That means you're fulfilling purpose. And that, my friend, is proper living. That's good, amazing living. And I know the Lord will continue to do that because you're willing to go wherever he says go. Like, you're not going to say, I can't do that, won't do that. I'm not comfortable with that, so I'm not going to. Like, that's what I mean by calling you a Wonder Woman or Superwoman, because I even if you are fearful, all right, well, I can't detect it, because you'll go out there and just, I remember there was one particular mission trip that you did that was high in the mountains, and you were, I mean, that was a trip that I remember.
That was challenging.
Praying for you the most,
mm-hmm.
All right? Because there was just so much going on during that time physically, and there were just so many challenges. And but the fact that you did that, I remember thinking, wow, this woman is incredible. And I can totally relate to you when it comes to when you're exposed to something and you see the reality of something, because we all have our, there's stereotypes. If you've never been to that place, when you think about a particular place, you're going to have an idea of what you think it's like, right? And so, but when you've experienced it and realized that those images, that perspective, that's not the reality, and then you come back home and they're spewing out this false narrative, this wrong perspective, you have to have tons of grace, tons of it, because you have to say, wait a minute, before you rise up inside, you have to realize they haven't seen what you've seen. They didn't eat and hear the stories. They didn't touch their faces. Mm-hmm. So because of that, you've got to give them grace. Sometimes politely correct them, and sometimes just say, oh, well, and, because sometimes it's just not even worth the conversation sometimes. It's because they're just, they're not willing to have a different perspective. It's just some people just are comfortable. That comfort is, I tell you, is really one of the most detrimental things in our lives. Comfort. It's good to have comfort for certain things, but when it prohibits you from growing and prohibits you from seeing truth, then it's not a good thing at all. So I think what you were saying was spot on, and I can completely relate to that. You know, my dad and I going on different trips and coming home, and I'm a teenager, and I come back to school and people are wigging out because they didn't have the new Jordans. And I'm like, but these people were barefoot. Like,
Right.
you know what I'm saying? Like 6 years old, 10 years old, had no mother, no father. They're coming for food. Like, those things just has never, like everything being name brand and all that stuff. Like, I'm just not that chick. Because I've seen the poorest of the poor be incredibly grateful for little things, right? That'll wreck you in ways you can't even begin to put language to, you know, to see them so excited about something that's so small. And then you come here and people, you know, it can be so, different. We'll just leave it at that. Very different. And I get it. You know, you're a product of your environment. And so I'm not mad at that. I'm not going to be, like you said, I'm going to have that grace. And so when you start talking about your challenges, I want to be like, oh my gosh. And I think that's why we connect so well.
Yes.
Because in a world full of people that haven't had these experiences, I found someone who has. And we talk the same language and we get it, right? And so you're really a true sister of mine. I love your perspective on life, the way you love people. I love your heart. I love your drive, your tenacity. You are a woman of many gifts. So I love you, Jessica. And I really, really do. And I appreciate the way you live your life. It's very inspiring. It's inspiring I see your posts on Facebook and you'll put these incredible photos that you've done in different countries. And I sometimes will go through and read the comments. And I marvel at some of the things that people say. It's almost like there are people who are like, oh my gosh, I love what you're doing. It's so amazing, but I could never do that. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. Oh, wow. Oh, what courage you have. But there's no way in the world. And it's just like, you inspire people. You make them think. I know you do. And just based off the comments that come when I read your comment section, it's just, I know that you're making a difference more than you realize. Because when they click off of you, they don't forget. Like when they're driving somewhere or when they're getting ready to go to bed or when they're, in the shower, they're thinking about those pictures. They're thinking about your perspective and the blurb that you wrote about that particular picture and how it's so different from probably what they were feeling or thinking. And so I know that you're making an impact more than you realize. Some people will never really put language to that or have that conversation with you. But yeah, they're very much impacted by what you're doing. I know that for a fact.
Thank you.
All right, so I want to talk about when we partnered up and we went to Uganda together. This was 2019, right?
Oh goodness, everything's a blur after 2020.
No,
yeah,
right? I think it was
2019.
I think it was 2019, right before all this stuff happened. And so we went to Uganda with Go Overflow, and she was a photojournalist there. And I don't know, I saw you. I got to see you work. I got to see my friend work. And oh gosh, you are passionate and you are you're fearless. That's what I saw. Like you didn't care about the inconveniences around you. You just jumped out there and was just like, I'm going to do this. And it was so sweet to watch you work. And you are sensitive when you work. Now let me explain that. When you said it a couple times today, you said that there are moments where you know that it just isn't, even though it may be the perfect photograph to take, you're sensitive enough to say, but it's inappropriate right now, and I'm going to let that moment pass. That, my friend, is powerful, because that's not always the case with photojournalism. Some people think it's about the photograph. It's about the photograph. It's about the photograph. But you're sensitive to the moment. And if you need to pass that incredible photo by so that you're sensitive and respectful for the culture or for the sensitivity of the moment, kudos to you for that, Jessica. That's a big deal. That's a very big deal. And I know there's people who will say, I've seen it so many times, well, they'll say, if you're going to do mission work, you don't need pictures, to show what you've been doing, because you're just kind of let everybody know what you're doing. And those people, I've heard people say, would you want your picture taken in the worst moment of your life? And I've heard all these kind of things, but what people don't know, and they say from the comfort of their home, and they haven't been anywhere. Listen, what people need to know is that people who feel invisible love it when you take their picture and tell their story. They are willing and they want you to do that. And they don't feel like that's the lowest part of their lives.
Right. That's their norm.
Right. That's their norm. Like, maybe up against your life, you may think that would be the lowest part, but you have to understand you can't speak from your perspective. You have to understand that they're living their lives and they're having a great time. It's just like someone coming to take a picture of you right now, right where you are. And you're like, yeah, this is great. No problem. Same thing with them. And there are times that there are a few that don't want you to take their picture, and that's fine. Same thing here. But many people love, all across the world, love for people to take their picture and tell their story. And they love what my friend Jessica does. And so I had to say that, because when I read that, I'm like, what are you talking about? It sounds good. It sounds good from our perspective, but it's just not the reality. It's just not. So you want to speak into that?
Yeah, I've had, that is a hard balance. It really is, to not feel like I am exposing people for my own gain, but doing it out of a heart of educating, inspiring, and just showing beauty. And, we just said, yeah, that might be your version of worse. That's their best day. So take a step back and into where you're at and look at it, look at it in humanity. There is a balance. I went on this one trip where the coordinator said, we don't need, you don't have to focus on kids crying, but I do know we need some emotional ones. And I was like, okay, I get it. It does tell a certain story, but I will, but always having a sensitive heart and just praying, okay, God, let me make the right choice. Okay. Yeah. And it is a case by case situation. I also, there was a time where I will post photos, obviously, as you said, and one person contacted me, it was a couple of years ago, privately, and said, in paraphrasing, but essentially I didn't really feel comfortable with you sharing photos, but I've since come back from overseas and now I get it. And so, like in the slums, she was really struggling with a couple images I shared of people living in that environment. And she goes, well, now I get it. And so there's also, and I've taken pictures in the U.S. in some low-income areas. Also, I was part of a project for several Christmases where, what is it called? Helping Portraits, where low-income families in our area, it happens all across the world, but I was involved in it here, where they were invited and I came and took their picture and it was printed and framed and they shopped for their kids. It was all free. And when you don't have a lot of money, you don't have money for pictures. And obviously in overseas, you definitely, in those low income, they don't have money for anything. But even low income here, that's a luxury. And so one gentleman had a picture of himself, and he had one picture of himself that we took, and he said, I'm going to give it to my son so he can remember me. And if I go back to the same place, many times I don't always go back to the same place, but if I do, I'll print out pictures, and those are priceless gifts, because that might be the only image that their kids have of their parents or that they have of their kids. And the immortality rate's high. So there was a pregnant woman I met in Costa Rica, and she had the baby died because they were so far away from medical care. It took too long to get there. And so, but if they had a picture, you don't think of that when it's so accessible to us. We have phones. I take pictures of my kids at any second that I want. But when you're in a situation and someone comes and says, I've got this. That's worth $1 million. And we don't always think of it that way. But it doesn't always have to be overseas as well. I mean, there's poverty everywhere you look. It's in every city. My specific niche is being in very, very different cultures, not just US. But that doesn't mean my heart doesn't want to, shape what's happening here too. I've had that come up in the last year or so of, well, why aren't you taking pictures here? And it's like, well, I only want to go where God leads, and I don't feel led. And if an opportunity arises, it's not that I'm going to turn it down. It's just we'll see. What I'm pursuing is this niche. That doesn't mean God won't open a door and I won't say walk through it. So I think we have to be careful, but we're very critical of everybody with everything they do. That they call it, and this, forgive the terminology, but they call it poverty porn. And not that I've been accused of it, but someone brought up that topic of how do you balance what you're sharing with the world with just trying to get exposure. And it's the heart. If someone knows me, I have to rest in the fact that if someone knows me, they know my heart is not to say, look what I did. Although I'm proud of what I've captured, it's to show humanity and to change perspective. And so it can be, I mean, this world is cruel. We judge very quickly on every single little thing. So I haven't gotten a lot of pushback over the years, but it is something to always be aware of and always checking our heart.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So tell me, if you had any advice to give someone who would love to be a photojournalist around the world, what would you say?
I would say to, first of all, ask yourself why you want to do it. I think you need to enter into this particular field or situations with the right heart. I actually do a lot of this pro bono. There are people who make a living doing it, but if you do it for nonprofits, they don't have a lot of money. So it depends where your heart is leading. I mean, you can do it as a full-time job. Definitely, in my case, I didn't have to have a full 4-year education for it. That doesn't mean that it doesn't bring some positives that I don't possess. But if you want to go overseas, I would say start small, because it's very intense. It invades on everything, your space, your mental capacity, your spiritual wellness, I mean, everything. So I'd say start small, try it out, try where you're at, but no matter what, you always have to be on. It's just always listening and being ready. And even though it sounds like you're just walking around all day taking pictures, it's tiring. At the end of the day, it's very tiring, I think, if done well, because you're just always searching for a story to tell. And the most pictures I ever took was on our trip to Uganda, and we were there a long time, granted, but there's a lot of after work too. Yeah. So you take the pictures, but then there's organizing, and then there's naming, and then there's editing, and then so just keep in mind, it sounds fun, it sounds glorious, but there's more to it. So just check your heart, do some things around where you're at. If you want to do it internationally, take a short trip, and be ready to be wrecked, hopefully in a good way.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Being wrecked just comes with the territory. For sure. All right. So please tell us how we can get in contact with you. If there's an organization out there who would love for you to come to their particular country or work with their nonprofit, they need to know how to get you. And so tell us about your website and just tell us all of how we can get to you.
So the website is underthetreedesigns.org. And basically it's a one-stop shop. I actually work on both sides of the camera from my day job as well. So you'll find extra information there, but there's a portfolio by country, so you can see the work. They can contact me by email at uttd@sbcglobal.net. And you can even call me or text me. So that's 618-799-9340. I don't have a specific page just for this work, but I basically kind of mix up professional and personal all the time. I felt like that's a good way just to brand myself, because I feel like I'm more than just one thing. So if you want to see or follow me, you can also do that on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. More active on Instagram and Facebook, but it's just my name, Jessica Ambuehl.
Awesome. Jessica, this has been so wonderful. I'm so grateful that you took the time to be on Embracing Freedom Today's podcast. I'm just, I'm just talking to you makes me want to get back out there. I'll be honest with you. I miss it. And there are moments where I literally ache, and I mean that. Like, that's not figurative. My heart literally aches to go back, and it'll last for several days. And I'll be like, oh, Lord, open up the world again. We gotta get back out there and love them to people. So, yeah, I'm just so grateful for our friendship. I'm grateful for what you do. I just love your heart. I just love your heart. And like I said, you're a great inspiration, more than you realize, Jessica. I'll put money on it. I'm telling you, more than you realize. So thank you for being an inspiration to me. And I know that people who have heard what you've said, listen, go to her website, y'all, and look at these incredible pictures. You saw some today, but there's so much more on her website. And find out other things that she does. She's an incredible actress as well, y'all. Y'all have to check her out. She's fantastic on so many levels. Everything that she does, she puts it, she goes forward with such an excellent, in such an excellent way. So y'all just support this wonderful woman. And if you know of an organization who may want someone to tell their story in such a very sensitive and a very powerful way, make that connection and call this beautiful woman, because she's ready to go. She's ready to go. Am I right?
I'm right. Passport's up to date. We're good.
Ready to go. Ready to go. All right. So listen, Jessica, God bless you. Thank you so much for this time. And we'll be watching to see what the next place calls for you to come and love on the people there. And hopefully we'll get a chance to link up and go somewhere together again. It was a blessing and joy to serve alongside you, sis.
Same here.
Thank you so much for joining us at Embracing Freedom Today podcast. I am so grateful that you were a part of this day. I know that you learned so much, and I want you to research Jessica Ambuehl. You're going to love what you find. I hope it inspires you. Share it with your friends and family members, and come back next week, because we have another guest that's also going to be very, very inspiring for you to learn more about. And this is what this is all about: embracing your freedom to be who God called you to be, freedom to go wherever He says go, embracing that freedom so that you can fulfill your purpose in Christ, right? All right. So listen, next week, don't miss it. All right. And I'll see you next week. Thank you all so much for embracing freedom today. God bless.
Thank you so much for watching Embracing Freedom Today. We'd love to stay connected. Just follow us on all of our social media platforms. We are Embracing Freedom Today on Facebook and on Instagram. You can also visit embracingfreedomtoday.com. And don't forget to listen to our Embracing Freedom Today podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. We hope that you were encouraged and inspired to embrace your freedom today. We'll see you next week.